Once upon a time, there were two cousins who grew up together in the same village, sharing the same games, the same dusty streets, and the same afternoons under the shade of olive trees. But fate took them down completely different paths. One of them, Salma, married a prosperous merchant who inherited 3 fabric stores in the city. The other, Nadia, fell in love with a humble carpenter who barely had tools to work with. Salma lived in a spacious house with marble courtyards and fountains that sang at noon. Nadia lived in a small dwelling with cracked walls and a roof that leaked when it rained. But what hurt the most wasn't the difference in fortune, but the way Salma treated her cousin. Every time Nadia went to visit her, Salma reminded her how wrong she had been to choose love over security. She would tell her with a cold smile that love didn't put bread on the table, and that sooner or later she would regret having rejected proposals from more well-off men. Nadia endured in silence because she needed the work. Salma had hired her to clean her house, wash her children's clothes, and prepare meals when she received important visitors, but she never paid her in coins. At the end of each workday, Salma would give her leftover food, stale bread, bruised fruit, and tell her that was more than enough for someone who didn't know how to manage her life. Nadia returned home each night with swollen feet and a heavy heart, but she never complained in front of her husband. He worked from dawn until night, carving furniture with his own hands, trying to sell what he could at the market. They had 2 small children who looked at the world with huge, hungry eyes. Each night, before sleeping, Nadia and her husband prayed together, asking for patience, asking for something better, asking that one day their children wouldn't have to go through the same thing. One day, the carpenter couldn't take it anymore. He sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, and told Nadia that he could no longer bear to see her humiliated. He told her he couldn't keep living off his cousin's crumbs, that he preferred to try something different, even if it meant leaving her alone for a while. Nadia felt afraid, but nodded. She knew her husband was a good man, and that if he made that decision, it was because he truly saw no other way out. The next morning, he prepared a small backpack with some bread, water, and a blanket. He said goodbye to his children with a kiss on the forehead, and to Nadia with a promise. He would return when he had something to offer them. And so, without a clear direction, the carpenter left the village. He walked for hours under the scorching sun, crossed dry fields and dusty paths, until he reached the outskirts of a dense forest that people avoided. They said that travelers got lost in that place, that there were strange creatures, and that the trees seemed to move on their own. But the carpenter wasn't afraid of tales. He was afraid of returning empty-handed. He entered the forest with firm steps, but soon realized the place was more confusing than he imagined. The trees were so tall they barely let sunlight through, and the roots snaked across the ground as if they wanted to trap him. He tried to go back, but all paths looked the same. Night began to fall, and with it came the cold. The carpenter stopped next to a tree, shivering, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. It was then that he heard footsteps. He looked up and saw a small girl, dressed in a dark shawl, running between the trees. He called to her, but she didn't respond. He followed her instinctively, thinking that perhaps she knew the way out. The girl ran fast, as if floating, and the carpenter had to make an effort not to lose sight of her. Finally, she stopped in front of an enormous structure that seemed to have been forgotten by time. It was an old mansion, covered in vines, with broken windows and doors of rotted wood. The carpenter hesitated. Something about that place didn't feel right. But the girl had disappeared inside, and he had nowhere else to go. He pushed the main door, which gave way with a long, eerie creak. Inside, the air smelled of dampness and something else, something he couldn't identify. There was furniture covered in dust, crooked paintings on the walls, and at the back of the hall, a lit fireplace. Over the fire was a large pot, and from it came a delicious aroma of meat stew. The carpenter approached cautiously, and just as he extended his hand to check if it was real, he heard a voice behind him, a soft but firm voice. The girl was there, smiling. She told him her name was Layla and that she lived in that mansion with her grandmother. She explained that it wasn't common to receive visitors and that most people who arrived there did so with bad intentions. But something in the carpenter's eyes told her he was different. Layla invited him to sit, eat, and tell her his story. The carpenter, exhausted and hungry, accepted. While he ate, he told her about his life, about Nadia, about his children, about the constant humiliation, about the poverty that was drowning them. Layla listened in silence, and when he finished, she nodded slowly. She told him she understood his pain and that she wanted to help him. She explained that in that mansion there was a long hallway with 5 doors. Behind the last door, she told him, he would find chests full of silver. He could take what he wanted, but with one condition. He must not open any of the other 4 doors. What was behind them was none of his business, and if he opened them, the consequences would be severe. The carpenter promised to obey. Layla guided him to the hallway, and he walked slowly, feeling his heart beat strongly. The doors were identical, all of dark wood with golden locks. He stopped in front of each one, feeling the temptation to open them, but remembering Layla's words. Finally, he reached the 5th door. He opened it carefully, and what he saw left him breathless. There were chests stacked to the ceiling, all overflowing with silver coins. He took a cloth bag hanging from the wall, filled it halfway, and left the hallway. Layla was waiting for him in the hall. When she saw that he had only taken what was necessary, she smiled. She told him he was a wise man, and that for that reason everything he carried was his by right. She warned him that if he had been greedy, if he had filled the bag to bursting, he wouldn't have been able to leave the mansion. Something would have stopped him. The carpenter thanked her, and Layla accompanied him to the edge of the forest, showing him the way back. Before saying goodbye, she reminded him not to tell anyone about that place, because her grandmother wasn't as understanding as she was, and if someone else arrived with bad intentions, they wouldn't leave alive. The carpenter nodded and walked back to his village with the bag over his shoulder. The next day, he arrived home. Nadia could hardly believe it when she saw him enter with food, new clothes for the children, and enough coins to buy new tools. He told her everything, except the exact location of the place. He told her about Layla, about the warning, and about the doors he shouldn't open. Nadia cried with happiness, and together they began planning their future. Over time, the carpenter opened his own workshop. His furniture was so good that people came from distant towns to buy it. They bought a bigger house, with a garden where the children could play. Nadia stopped working for Salma, and for the first time in years, she felt free. But Salma didn't take long to notice the change. One day she went to visit them, feigning interest, but in reality she was full of envy. She couldn't understand how her cousin, who previously had nothing, now lived better than she did. She insisted on knowing what had happened, but Nadia remained firm and revealed nothing. Salma returned home furious, and that night she demanded her husband investigate. He, tired of her constant complaints, decided to invite the carpenter to dinner. During the evening, Salma was kind, flattering, almost unrecognizable. But when the children went to play, her husband asked the carpenter directly where he had gotten the money from. The carpenter tried to evade the question, but the merchant insisted. And finally, pressured by the hospitality they had shown him, he ended up telling the story. He described the forest, the mansion, the doors, and Layla's warning. Salma listened from the kitchen, memorizing every word. The next morning, without telling anyone, the merchant, dressed in old, torn clothes, took 2 large sacks from his warehouse and headed to the forest. He had decided that if his poor brother-in-law had found silver, he would find something much more valuable. He walked for hours until he found the mansion. Upon seeing it, he felt a mixture of fear and excitement. He pushed the door and entered. Layla was there, waiting for him. She asked who he was and what he was doing in that place. The merchant, with a trembling voice, told her he was a poor man looking for work, that he had gotten lost and needed help. Layla looked at him fixedly, doubting, but finally decided to give him a chance. She explained the same rules. He could go to the hallway, open the 5th door, and take silver. But he must not touch the other 4 doors. The merchant nodded, feigning gratitude, and ran toward the hallway. He opened the 5th door and saw the chests of silver. He filled one of his sacks, but while doing so, he couldn't help thinking about what might be behind the other doors. If there was silver here, he reasoned, in the others there must be something better. Gold, perhaps, or jewels. He left the sack on the floor and opened the 4th door. Inside there were mountains of gold coins, shining and perfect. Without hesitating, he emptied the sack of silver and filled it with gold. But his mind didn't stop there. He opened the 3rd door and found precious stones, rubies, emeralds, sapphires. He emptied the gold and filled the sack with gems. Then he opened the 2nd door and found pearls the size of eggs, perfect and luminous. He exchanged them for the gems. Finally, he reached the 1st door. It was decorated with intricate carvings, and something inside told him that what was there was the most valuable of all. He opened the door with trembling hands, and inside he found enormous sacks piled to the ceiling. He approached one, opened it, and put his hand in. It was wheat, common, ordinary wheat. He froze, confused. Why would they keep wheat in the 1st door, the most decorated one? Before he could think more, he heard heavy footsteps behind him. A deep, furious voice resonated in the hallway. It was Layla's grandmother, and she wasn't happy. The merchant dropped everything and ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, crossed the forest without looking back, stumbling over roots and branches until he finally came out into the clearing. He arrived home at dawn, exhausted, empty-handed, and with bleeding feet. Salma found him lying on the floor, almost unconscious. For days, the merchant was sick, with high fever and pain all over his body. Salma, instead of taking care of him, spent time with the manager of their lands, a young and strong man who did all the work her husband could no longer do. When the merchant could finally get up, he discovered that Salma barely spoke to him. She didn't prepare food for him, didn't ask how he felt. One night, while looking for something to eat in the kitchen, he found all the pots empty. Salma had eaten with the manager and hadn't left him anything. The merchant felt something he had never experienced before: real hunger. And with hunger came understanding. He remembered the 1st door, the wheat, and finally understood. Wheat was the most valuable because without food, nothing else mattered. All the gold, all the jewels, all the pearls in the world were useless if there was no bread to eat. He cried silently that night, repentant of his greed, his cruelty, all the times he had humiliated others, believing himself superior. The next morning, weak and ashamed, he walked to his brother-in-law's house. Nadia opened the door and almost didn't recognize him. He was thin, pale, with dirty and torn clothes. She let him in without questions, prepared him a plate of hot food, and waited for him to eat before speaking. When he finished, the merchant told her everything. He told her about his greed, how he had opened all the doors, how he had lost everything, and how Salma had abandoned him in his most vulnerable moment. Nadia listened in silence, and when he finished, she simply told him he could stay with them until he recovered. She offered him work in her husband's workshop, a place to sleep, and food every day. The merchant couldn't believe it. After everything he had done to them, after years of contempt and humiliation, they were offering him help. He asked her why, and Nadia answered calmly that she didn't believe in returning evil with more evil, that they had learned that life rewards kindness, and that punishing someone who was already suffering wouldn't make them better people. When the carpenter returned from the market that afternoon and saw his brother-in-law sitting in his house, he said nothing. He just nodded, accepting his wife's decision. That night, as they dined together, the merchant looked around and saw something he had never valued before: peace. There were no shouts, no demands, no competition. Just a family sharing what they had, grateful for the little or much that life gave them. And in that moment, he understood he had spent his entire life chasing the wrong thing. If you made it this far, leave me in the comments what you thought of this story, and if you've ever felt that greed made you lose something important. Over time, the merchant recovered. He worked alongside the carpenter, learned the trade, and little by little rebuilt his life. He never saw Salma again, who left with the land manager and left everything behind. And although he lost his fortune, his house, and his pride, the merchant gained something he had never had before: gratitude. He learned to value a plate of food, a bed to sleep in, and the company of people who treated him with respect. He learned that true wealth wasn't in chests of gold or in large mansions, but in having a heart at peace and people who loved you even in your worst moments. And so, the two cousins who were once at opposite extremes of life ended up working side by side, one teaching and the other learning, both grateful for the lessons that life had given them in such different ways. If this story left you with something, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. In a city where the trade of fabrics and silks was the heart of the economy, there lived a tailor named Omar, renowned for making suits for the most important men in the region. His shop occupied 3 floors of an old building in the center, and his display windows exhibited imported velvets, brocades, and linens that shimmered in the sunlight. Omar had inherited the business from his father, who in turn inherited it from his own. And he felt proud to continue this family tradition that had already spanned 4 generations. But Omar had an obsession that consumed him. He needed a male heir to continue the legacy. Each night, as he closed the shop and reviewed the day's accounts, he looked at the photographs of his ancestors hanging on his office wall and wondered if his lineage would end with him. He was married to Amina, a woman of calm temperament and skilled hands, who helped him in the business by embroidering the most delicate details on the garments. 5 years of marriage had passed without Amina becoming pregnant, and the pressure from Omar's family grew with each gathering, with each comment disguised as concern. It was during the 6th year that Amina finally felt the first symptoms. The dizziness came one morning while she was preparing breakfast, and she had to sit down because her legs were trembling. Omar, seeing her pale, immediately called the family doctor. When the doctor confirmed the pregnancy, Omar couldn't contain his emotion. He hugged Amina with a force that almost left her breathless, but then, that same night, when they were alone in the bedroom, he told her something she would never forget. "Amina, if a boy is born, I'll build you the most beautiful house in the city. But if it's a girl..." He paused, staring at her intently. "You'll have to leave. I cannot allow my surname to be lost in the hands of a son-in-law. I don't know, who hasn't worked a single day in this business." Amina felt the world stop. She tried to argue, to remind him that a son or daughter were equally valuable. But Omar had already made his decision. "That's just how things are," he said, turning his back and switching off the light. The months passed, and Amina's belly grew. She worked fewer hours in the shop, but never stopped embroidering. In fact, she began to embroider with more dedication than ever, as if each stitch were a silent prayer. She embroidered flowers, birds, entire constellations on handkerchiefs and tablecloths that she then stored in a wooden trunk. She didn't know why she did it, but she felt these pieces would be important someday. When the moment of childbirth arrived, Omar waited outside the room with clenched fists and a tense jaw. The midwife finally emerged, with an expression that revealed nothing, and told him, "It's a healthy, beautiful girl." Omar didn't respond. He simply nodded, went in to see Amina for a moment, looked at the baby without touching her, and left the house. During the following 2 weeks, Omar barely spoke. He kept his word in a cold manner. He bought Amina a small house on the outskirts of the city, near the river, far from the commercial district. The house had 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard with a pomegranate tree. It wasn't luxurious, but it had what was necessary. Omar left some money, enough for a few months, and before leaving, he pronounced the words of divorce according to tradition. Amina didn't cry in front of him. She waited for him to leave, closed the door, and only then allowed the tears to fall. The first months were hard. Amina tried to sell some of the embroidery she had made during pregnancy, but the market was saturated. Many women embroidered, and she didn't have the reputation or contacts to stand out. The money Omar had left her ran out quickly, and she began to ration food. She ate once a day so that her daughter, whom she named Salma, would have enough milk. One afternoon, while Salma slept in her crib, someone knocked on the door. Amina opened it and found an old woman leaning on a cane carved with animal figures. The woman had a face furrowed with deep wrinkles and eyes that shone with a clarity unsettling for someone her age. "Excuse me, daughter," said the old woman with a raspy voice. "I've been walking since dawn and haven't had a bite. Would you have something for a tired old woman?" Amina hesitated. In her pantry, only half a loaf of bread remained, the last until she could get some money. But something in the old woman's gaze prevented her from closing the door. "Come in," she said, and offered her the bread along with a glass of water. The old woman ate slowly, with a silent gratitude that filled the small kitchen. When she finished, she stood up with difficulty and said, "I don't have money to pay you, but I have something that might serve you better." From the folds of her dark cloak, she pulled out an antique sewing machine made of forged iron, with golden details forming patterns of leaves and vines. It was surprisingly small, about the size of a shoebox, but weighed as if it were made of lead. If this story is captivating you, leave me a comment telling me what you think is going to happen with that machine. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. "This belonged to my grandmother," said the old woman. "It's not an ordinary machine, but you must use it carefully, and never, ever let greed dominate you." Before Amina could ask questions, the old woman went out the door and disappeared down the dusty road. Amina observed the machine for hours. On the base were tiny engravings, almost imperceptible, of figures that seemed to dance. That night, after putting Salma to bed, she decided to try it. She had fabric scraps she had brought from Omar's house and thought about making a small dress for the girl. She prepared the threads, placed the fabric under the needle, but was so tired that she could barely make 3 stitches before falling asleep in the chair. When she woke at dawn, what she saw left her paralyzed. The dress was finished. Not only that, it was a masterpiece. The seams were perfect, invisible, and someone had added embroidery on the collar depicting a garden full of butterflies. The fabric, which was simple white cotton, now had a subtle shine, as if it had been treated with something special. Amina searched the entire house for an explanation. No one had entered. The doors and windows were closed. During the following days, Amina experimented with the machine. Each night she left fabric and thread prepared, and each morning she found a finished garment, always with details she had never planned. A secret pocket, a hem with gold thread, a mother-of-pearl button where there should have been a wooden one. The garments weren't just beautiful, They were perfect. She began to sell them at the market, but carefully. She didn't want to attract too much attention. She charged fair prices, never excessive, and with the money she bought food, clothes for Salma, and saved a little for the future. Life improved. They weren't rich, but they didn't go hungry either. Salma grew quickly. She was a curious girl, with big eyes and easy laughter. At 4 years old, she was already helping her mother organize threads by color. At 7, she drew designs on paper and asked Amina if she could sew them. The girl knew nothing about the magic machine. To her, her mother was simply the best seamstress in the world. But one night, when Salma was 11 years old, she couldn't sleep. She had had a nightmare and went down to the kitchen to get water. She heard a strange sound coming from the workshop where her mother worked, a soft, rhythmic hum, accompanied by what sounded like tiny laughter. Salma approached silently and looked through the crack in the door. What she saw left her breathless. On the table, next to the sewing machine, were small luminous figures, no taller than her pinky finger, moving at an impossible speed. They had human form, but their bodies glowed with a pale blue light. They worked together, passing threads to each other, cutting fabric with tiny scissors, laughing and whispering in a language Salma didn't recognize. The next day, Salma told her mother what she had seen. Amina remained silent for a long moment, and then sighed deeply. "I suppose it was inevitable that you'd discover it," she said. She told her the whole story. The old woman, the machine, the creatures that worked every night. "They are spirits of the fabric," Amina explained. "According to the old woman, they are bound to this machine by an ancient debt and can only be freed when the secret is revealed by someone of pure heart." Salma listened attentively, her eyes shining with fascination. "And what will happen now?" she asked. That night, the old woman returned. This time she came accompanied by a faint light that seemed to float around her. "The pact has been broken," she announced. "The creatures will soon depart. But first, they are permitted to grant one last wish." Amina felt panic. This was her livelihood. Without the machine, how would she support Salma? But before she could speak, Salma stepped forward. "I want them to teach me," said the girl with a firm voice. "I want to learn everything they know about sewing, embroidering, designing. I don't want them to leave without giving me that gift." The old woman smiled, and for the first time since they'd known her, she seemed truly pleased. "Wise decision, little one. True wealth is not in what others do for you, but in what you learn to do for yourself." For 3 months, every night, the creatures taught Salma. They showed her forgotten techniques, taught her to see fabric fibers as if they were rivers of energy, whispered to her the secrets of natural dyes and stitches that could make a garment last generations. Salma absorbed each lesson with a dedication that surprised even her mother. When the creatures finally departed, saying goodbye with a flash of light that illuminated the entire house, Salma was no longer a child. She was an artisan in training. And although the machine was still there, it no longer worked by itself. Now it was just a machine, beautiful and antique, but ordinary. Salma continued her mother's business, but took it further. She experimented with new designs, mixed traditional styles with modern ideas she saw in magazines that arrived from the capital. At 18, she already had clients from other cities who traveled specifically to commission dresses from her. At 23, she had opened her own workshop with 5 employees. At 27, her name was known throughout the country. Amina, now with gray in her hair and wrinkles around her eyes, watched her daughter with a pride that didn't fit in her chest. They had gone from that little house by the river to a larger property in the city center, with gardens and fountains. But Salma never forgot where they came from. Each month, she donated clothes to orphanages and nursing homes. Each year, she organized free workshops to teach needy women the craft of sewing. It was during one of those workshops that Amina saw a man among the crowd of people waiting to receive help. He was in line to receive clothes, hunched over, with a cane and threadbare garments. When his turn came, Amina recognized him. It was Omar. She hadn't seen him in almost 30 years. The man who was once the proud owner of the best tailor shop in the city now seemed like a shadow of himself. His hands trembled, and his gaze was that of someone who has lost everything. "Omar," Amina said softly. He looked up, and in his eyes there was a flash of recognition followed by deep shame. "Amina, I didn't expect to see you here. What happened?" she asked, without a trace of resentment in her voice. Omar lowered his head. "After you left, I remarried. I had the son I wanted. I called him Rashid and raised him to take my place." He paused, his voice breaking. "I trained him from childhood, gave him everything. But as he grew, he became different, careless, arrogant. He got in with bad company. He started gambling, drinking. I tried to correct him, but he yelled at me, told me I was a bitter old man. When he turned 25, I gave him control of the business, thinking responsibility would straighten him out." Omar swallowed with difficulty. In less than 3 years, he lost everything. He sold the fabrics at ridiculous prices to pay gambling debts. He stopped paying suppliers. Clients left. When I tried to intervene, he threw me out of my own shop. The last time I saw him, he told me I was a burden. The building was auctioned off by creditors 2 years ago. Since then, I've lived on charity." Amina listened in silence. She should have felt satisfaction, a confirmation that her suffering had been avenged by life itself. But what she felt was something more complex, a mixture of sadness for the lost time and a strange peace knowing that she and Salma had built something better. "Come with me," Amina said. She took him to where Salma was, who had just finished teaching an embroidery stitch to a group of older women. "Salma," Amina said, "there's someone you should meet. This is Omar, your father." Salma looked at the old man in front of her. She had grown up hearing stories about him, most of them painful, but the woman she was now, the one who had been shaped by the teaching of magical beings and her mother's example, saw beyond resentment. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" Salma asked. Omar shook his head. "Then stay with us. There's a room in the house we don't use, and tomorrow, if you want, you can help in the workshop. We always need someone who knows about fabrics." Omar cried. He couldn't help it. Tears ran down his wrinkled face as he repeated, "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your kindness." "It's not about deserving," Salma said. "It's about choosing to be better than our circumstances." In the following months, Omar slowly integrated into the workshop routine. He couldn't sew like before. His hands no longer had the steadiness, but he could organize, he could advise, he could tell stories about ancient techniques that Salma found fascinating. And every night, before sleeping, he sat in the small garden of the house and looked at the stars, wondering how he had been so blind for so long. One day, while checking some fabrics in the storage room, he found the old sewing machine that had started it all. It was on a high shelf, covered in dust, but well cared for. He ran his fingers over the engravings and felt a strange warmth emanating from the metal. "That machine has a story," said Salma, appearing behind him. "I'd like to hear it," Omar responded, and Salma told him. She spoke to him of the old woman, of the magical creatures, of the nights of learning. She told him how her mother had never used that magic to become rich, but only to survive with dignity. She explained that the true lesson wasn't in the magic, but in the wisdom of knowing when to let go of power and trust in one's own effort. Omar listened attentively, and when Salma finished, he said something he had never said in his life. "I was wrong. I was wrong about everything I valued. I thought a surname was the most important thing. I thought a male heir guaranteed a legacy. But legacy isn't in the name. It's in the actions, in the values you transmit, in the lives you touch. Salma put a hand on her father's shoulder. What's important is that you understand it now. The years passed. Salma expanded her business, opened sewing schools in different cities, published books on design techniques. She married an architect who shared her vision of helping disadvantaged communities, and together they started projects that combined textile design and sustainable construction. Amina lived to see her grandchildren, who grew up hearing the story of the magic machine as if it were a fairy tale. Omar spent his last years in peace, working in the workshop until his health no longer allowed it. Before dying, he gathered Salma and Amina and told them, "Thank you for teaching me that the true value of a person isn't in their gender, nor in their inheritance, but in their heart. Salma, you are the child I always needed, not because you're male or female, but because you're good, wise, and generous. Forgive me for taking so long to see it." The sewing machine remains in the house, now as a family relic. Salma sometimes looks at it and remembers those magical nights of her childhood. Her children ask her if the story is real, and she always responds, "The most real magic isn't what makes things appear out of nothing, but what transforms people." If you made it this far and you're left thinking about this story, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it.